Carl Jung was ostracized from the scientific community for being a mystic quack. But lo and behold, modern neuroscience has begun to confirm some of Carl Jung's craziest ideas. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through two of these ideas. The first is going to be the concept of the unconscious as it relates to Ian McGilchrist's work on the difference in our hemispheres. The second is going to be a discussion of the collective unconscious and a few small studies that have actually suggested that we may have epigenetic and ancestral memories. Now let's dive into number one. First, I'm going to have to do a little bit of context painting. Think of why Jung and Freud had their famous bickering and disagreement. They both were, in some sense, innovators who'd come up with this concept of the unconscious, that our minds were not a totally rational machine that we controlled, which is what people thought in the 19th century. Our minds actually have forces inside of them that are influencing us, that are outside of our control. Now, even to this day, I don't think you quite understand how crazy that notion is. I want you to really think about this. This is popularly presented as the notion of the subconscious. This idea that everything you say gets interpreted by this computer in the back of your head that you don't control. And that's the thing that generates your thoughts and your moods. And so you should be very careful, because if you say anything, it will get filed inside of it. And so people would say, law of attraction, say nice things to yourself all the time, because if you say anything nasty, your brain is going to remember it about yourself. Now, this isn't a bad start, because this is the assertion that there's some type of filing cabinet or force or entity in our heads that we have to develop a relationship with. And if we want to get our minds working properly, we can't just decide what we want. We have to understand that we're almost dealing with an AI or a computer that's a little bit, it has its nuances, it has its character that we must learn to relate to. It's not perfect. It doesn't respond to reason and commands the way we want it to. We must learn how it works, our subconscious computer. So step one is that you run out there and you go buy The Secret, the law of attraction, and begin the affirmations. We're going to fix this unconscious mind of yours. Now, what Freud was asserting is something like this. Freud's model to explain the other things that exist inside of your head was split up into a superego and an id, or you could think of it like your primal instincts and your memorized commands and traumas and discipline from your society. So as you live your life, you'll get spanked, you'll get told by the law to do this and to do that. You'll go through experiences which will scare you. You'll go through punishment, you'll go through pain. And this will all be imprinted inside of your mind. Like the idea that modern people use of trauma. This gets stored inside of your imagination somewhere. And it has an enormous influence on how you behave, because you would be walking around your day and then all of a sudden this stuff will get puked up because maybe you recognize a stick that was used to beat you when you were younger, and the trauma will reassert out of your unconscious and take over your mind. And so you're not in control of this superego, this memory of being disciplined and punishment, because you don't own this thing. You must just understand what is in there and form a relationship with it. Likewise, you have these primal urges inside of your soul that are your instincts, your desire for lust, your desire for power, your desire perhaps even to die and end suffering. And these instincts bubble up as well and take possession of your ego. And you, the conscious thing that walks around, you don't have control of these things. These things are hardwired into you, and they're more powerful in some sense than you are. And what you need to do is learn to relate with these things and relate with these enormous forces that are pushing into your imagination all throughout your life, pushing into your conscious experience, trying to grapple hold of you and assert decisions upon you. Now, that's not a bad take. That's quite cool. Upvotes for Freud. Good man, Sigmund. Freud is painting this picture that your mind is like a thunderstorm and the gods live inside of you and they're striking lightning against you and pulling you in all sorts of directions, stretching you out, driving you towards various goals. But there's something very reductive about this. It's speaking about your base urges, what your testicles tell you, what your mammary glands do. Girls feel emotions in their mammary glands? I don't really understand women. I don't know. Maybe they do. This is just my guess that they get these signals coming from this. And also the trauma that you have inside of your mind. So the pain and struggle and suffering that you went through imprints itself upon you. Now, if you think about your lived experience, this is what a lot of it is like. You have memories blasting from your past, reminding you what not to do, making you afraid of certain things, trauma, as people say now. And you have instincts and urges driving you towards getting girls, getting boys, getting food, getting status, whatever it is. And your life is largely lived trying to negotiate between all these things, trying to fulfill the urges, the primal urges that you have without getting punishment again from the super society that lives above you. But what you'll notice about this is that this vision of the inner workings of your mind, these unconscious forces, is very callous, is very inhuman, and in some sense almost mechanical. Freud would postulate that at the center of our primal urges was one mechanical force, which was the libido. Nietzsche might have called this the will to power. And this doesn't really have a personality as we understand it. It just drives us towards reaching towards sex and life and reproduction. And we are willing to fight and get in conflict and compete and do everything in order to fulfill this libido. And then this superego above us is not really something with a character. It appears to us like an angry dad. You know, Freud's idea was that God himself was a sort of image that we imprinted upon this. But actually all it was is a filing cabinet for all our pain and all our trauma and all our bad memories. Now again, this is not a bad take. Most people are going to recognize this as how they live their lives. But Jung took issue with this. Jung was being a little bit pedantic on these points. Jung asserted that the other forces inside of our minds were not blunt mechanical forces, almost like machines operating in the background, imposing their drives and will upon us. Jung was saying that they have personality, that they have character, that they have a style and intelligence of themselves, that they can talk to us and communicate to us and even guide us and lead us. And they might even give us insight into, parapsychological phenomenon, which is obviously a big no-no. Now, all of this stuff, Freud and everybody was like, wait a second, Carl. Whoa, pull the brakes, Carl. What are you talking about, man? Sit down. It's like that meme where you have the guy from Breaking Bad, is it Walt Whitman? And he's sitting down with Jesse, I think his name is. And he's like, Jesse, what the fuck are you talking about? All these psychoanalysts, Freud and his big crew, they had come up with this decent theory that really fitted within 19th century thought, this idea of these mechanical forces pushing our mind and you need to relate to them and work with them. It all kind of fitted quite well and it had the chance of getting credibility, which it did. And then Carl comes along and basically says the unconscious is alive and intelligent and communicating with you. And when you're listening to your imagination, you're coming in contact with a spirit that you might even say is smarter than we are. But the psychoanalysts, they did not like this. They had a good thing going. They're trying to get credibility, trying to get the basics of their theory, this budding field of psychology, out into the world. And they didn't want to suddenly drench it in this irrational mysticism that would make them look goddamn bad. So they began to ostracize Carl and give him the cold shoulder. And Carl did not take this very well. He had spent his whole life working in the field of psychology, and he found himself basically as the spokesperson for this new movement of psychoanalysis, which looked like it was going to be the one that broke into the mainstream. And right as it was reaching its apex, he found himself getting booted out for his quackish, crazy theories. And Carl ends up spiraling and having a mental breakdown after this. You can think of it like a break-up. It's very emotionally stressful to go through something like that. Your heart aches. Well, in this instance, perhaps Jung's mind was saying to himself, did I just destroy my only chance or my main chance as leaving a great legacy for the future, as getting my ideas out into the Western canon? Did I just miss the boat as it was rising up about to reach the very top? Did I just screw up on that level? And during this breakup, Carl Jung's own mind does not do him any favors. It decides to reveal to him his theories in practice. He starts to have imposing visions upon himself. He starts to see things. He starts to essentially have a schizophrenic break, hear things, which he's all documented within the Red Book. And for quite a while, he thought he was literally starting to go insane. He felt like his imagination was speaking to him, which is what he proposed your imagination is supposed to do, but is also what most people propose as mental psychosis. And so Jung is tortured inside of his own mind, thinking he's going crazy, sleeping with a gun underneath his pillow so he's ready to blow his brains out if he feels like he's actually losing his mind. When World War I kicks off, And all of a sudden he realizes that his mental breakdown, with all these figures of corpses walking across Europe and all this blood washing across the fields of Europe, wasn't him necessarily going crazy, but was actually a premonition, perhaps even a prophecy of something that was just around the corner. He starts to realize that he might have received visions that have actually come true, which again confirms to him that there was something to the power of this imagination. There was some capacity within it that had a intelligence, perhaps a super intelligence, that we don't give it credit for. And Jung saw this as verification of his idea as correct. And so he spent the rest of his life essentially trying to take what he went through and take his thesis here and compartmentalize it into language that is digestible or acceptable for the scientific paradigm of the day. But he never really succeeded in doing this. This is where we get Jungian psychology, but do people take Jungian psychology that serious? Talking about archetypes, talking about all this stuff. It seems very unscientific. How do you falsify this? How do you study this? And this is where Ian McGilchrist and the theories of the hemispheres come in. Carl Jung died in 1961, but it was during this period that you begin to see the rise of what became neuroscience. You see, before this, if we wanted to study the mind, it was all a little bit speculative. You'd have to get somebody like Freud or Jung who would look at how people behave and look at the patterns in people's thoughts and come up with theories and throw theories at these patterns and try to give them labels. And it's a little bit intuitive. It's not very hard, you're just sort of speculating wildly about associations and patterns. This is obviously why psychology has a pretty bad reputation. Now, alongside of this, there were attempts to make harder and more scientific studies, and this was through the study of behavior. Famously, people looking at animals and doing things like giving a dog food and ringing a bell at the same time and doing that many times, and then eventually just ringing the bell and not giving the dog a food, but noticing that the dog's tongue would flop out and it would produce saliva as if to suggest that it had been conditioned to hear that sound and associate it with something. So they were watching and trying to study and come up with coherency here. But the real innovation began to happen when people began to look at injuries. So a guy would get hit really hard on the left side of his head and he'd lose the ability to speak. And somebody would notice that everybody who had a really hard hit in their head, about 90% of them couldn't speak anymore if it got hit in the left side, which made these people start to say, well, is there something about the left side of our brain that is associated with the capacity to speak? This came to the study of the brain and the assumption that certain areas of the brain control speech. And there was people all throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s getting into this. Now, you can see how this evolves into the most serious way of studying the mind, because they realize that certain brain regions, when they get damaged, change our personalities and our capacities. And so people say, well, the brain is obviously producing the mind. And so if we are to understand the brain, we should start to study it directly and try to figure out and map what it does. And this is obviously what evolves into neuroscience. Now, this is much harder because it's to do with the physical brain. It's not you speculating about the superego or about archetypes, even though there's quite a lot of intuitive intelligence to this. It's about you poking the brain in places and seeing what happens. Now, that's real, that's hard, that's something that other people can do. Other people can poke the brain in the same place and get the same result. Now, in the 60s, people with epilepsy began to have their brains cut in half, because surgeons realized that epilepsy is like an electrical storm in the brain. What's so goddamn cool is that if you cut the brain into two, the storm can't reach critical size and cause you that sort of headache and problems where people have seizures and stuff like this. If you cut the brain in half, the storm will isolate to one side but never take over both sides, which is actually quite fascinating. And so a lot of people who got this surgery were able to live fully functional as epileptics from there on out. But something weird began to happen. They started to show side effects. Now, they were completely functional, except for these weird little things. They would go and they would try to pick up a chocolate bar with one hand, and their other hand would slap their hand and then pick up a healthy apple or a treat or some sort. They would put on clothes, and then their other hand would come in and try to put on different clothes. And it started to show that their body was almost like fighting against itself, as if there was two separate characters inside of the body. Now, these experiments are very famous and very controversial. They became the foundation for a pop psychology notion that we have a left logical brain and a right artistic brain. And this idea actually did terrible, terrible things for the advancement of this body of knowledge because people stopped taking it seriously. This is very simplistic and actually kind of wrong, which leads to a lot of people saying, oh, this is junk. The whole hemispheric theory is a outdated model that people don't care about. But the unfortunate thing here is that this misses all the nuance about what is actually going on, because the hemispheres do operate in a profoundly different way. And the way that we can know this is by looking at some of the experiments ourselves. Here we have a gentleman called Joe who has had this surgery done to his brain, and this experimenter is testing how Joe responds to things getting sent to each of his eyes. Each of his eyes wired to one of his brains.
This time, instead of naming the word, I want you to point to the word.
Again, Joe sees two words simultaneously. Bell goes to his non-speaking right brain. Music to his speaking left brain. When asked to point to a picture of what he saw, he chooses Bell. But when asked why...
Okay, why'd you pick that one?
Music.
Music?
And when asked to explain...
It was music and bell, and it was a few minutes ago. Last time I heard any music was coming from the bells out here, banging away.
So the bell's outside here.
So, look good enough answer to me.
What's extraordinary is that Joe's speaking left brain concocts a plausible story of why he pointed to Bell, even when some of the other pictures more obviously represent music. Gazzaniga believes this determination to find cause and effect, this desire to explain, is the left hemisphere's most marvelous property.
So what you're going to see here is a gentleman called Joe. His brain has been cut in half. Now, I've shown this before. I recommend you check out the video Left Brain, Right Brain if you want me to go into this in more depth. But it's worth looking at it again because it's such a good explanation of how this works. You're going to see how Joe's two hemispheres process information separately and give information out separately and in interesting ways. So pay attention and watch closely.
Joe, I'm going to show you some things. I just want you to tell me what you see. And here we go. You ready? Look right at the dot.
Okay.
Right. Okay, you ready? Look right at the dot.
Grapes.
Good. When Joe focuses on a point, look right at the dot. Everything to the right of the point goes to his left brain, the dominant hemisphere for language and speech.
Look right at the dot.
So we can see here that when we flash a word or a picture,
Tree.
Joe is easily able to name it.
There we go.
See it.
Close your eyes and let your left hand do a little work here. Okay, what do you got there?
Pan.
Okay, very good. Now, when a word or a picture falls to the left of a fixation point, that information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. Joe is able to draw the picture with his left hand, the left hand getting its major control from the right half brain. What did you draw?
Okay.
What did you see?
Wheel on one side. I don't know what I saw on the other.
So even though
This is just so crazy when you think about it. It's so crazy. So in case you don't understand what's happening, they're flashing things to each eye. He's looking at a center point and then each eye is getting stuff flashed in. Now remember, his brain is cut in half. And everything that comes into the left hemisphere, because the eyes, again, they wire crosswise. I know that's weird, but that's how they work. So when you're staring at this, the information is going in and going to the left brain from one side. So every time you flash information to the left brain, to your conscious brain, the language brain, if you will, because you've got language and Broca's area in this brain, he's able to describe it very easily with language. Flashes pan or car or teddy bear or whatever it is. Now, the second that they flash something on the other side, he can't remember seeing anything. He's like, I didn't see anything. No, nothing came up. I didn't see anything. Now, what does that say about consciousness? Because it seems like one side is acting as the conscious side. This is the side that produces language. But there's another side that doesn't produce language, which is what we know about the brain. and is apparently unconscious. But then when they give the hand that is wired to this opposite brain, the right brain, they give it a pencil and they ask it to draw, he is capable of drawing the thing that he saw flashed up, and then he can identify it. But he can't explain why he drew it because he was unconscious of it. So this other force inside, this other brain inside of his head is able to see things and able to present them with symbols and pictures, but it has no access to the conscious mind, which is the left hemisphere, nor does it have access to our capacity to create and interpret language. Think about that. That's a big deal. So this dude's brain is cut in half, and we can see right here in front of us, these brains are acting like different characters. They're able to receive information and process information. And it seems like the left hemisphere is unaware that there's this other thing, this other dude, this other personality in there doing this stuff. But it's not even aware that it's able to do this or that this is happening. It can't comprehend this at all. Now, another experiment from Joe, once again, highlights just how weird this is. Just what our left brain, our conscious brain, our quote-unquote ego seems to do to hide this reality from us. Watch this.
Instead of naming the word, I want you to point to the word.
Again, Joe sees two words simultaneously. Bell goes to his non-speaking right brain. Music to his speaking left brain. When asked to point to a picture of what he saw, he chooses Bell. But when asked why...
Yeah, why'd you pick that one?
Music.
Music?
And when asked to explain...
There was music and bell, and it was a few minutes ago, last time I heard any music was coming from the bells out here.
Uh-huh.
Banging away.
So the bell's outside here?
So, look, good enough answer to me.
What's extraordinary is that Joe's speaking left brain concocts a plausible story of why he pointed to Bell, even when some of the other pictures more obviously represent music. Gazzaniga believes this determination to find cause and effect, this desire to explain, is the left hemisphere's most marvelous property.
Now, I don't think you've think about how crazy that is. Think about how crazy that is. So it shows him these two images. Again, this information gets processed in the separate hemispheres. So he's looking at the center, and one set of information goes to his right hemisphere. And this presents him the idea of a bell. And then the other one gives him the idea of music. And this goes into his left hemisphere, the conscious language processing hemisphere. He's then asked to point to what he saw using the hand that is connected to the right hemisphere, connected to the unconscious hemisphere. And this one chooses a bell, which is what he saw. Now, all the other pictures are of something musical. And that would be exactly what you would pick if that's what you saw in music. But instead, Joe's left hemisphere explains that he chose the bell because it represents music. Now, what is happening here? His left hemisphere is creating a rationalization. He's trying to find some type of narrative that explains what just happened to make it seem coherent, to make it make sense. He's coping, essentially. He's rationalizing and coping. Now, that's crazy. And this seems to be what our left hemisphere does. It generates rationalizations. It generates coherency and logic. It doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to be correct. It just has to be a story that helps us hold our reality together. So why is Ian McGilchrist so important? Well, Ian went through all of this and spent the time to try come up with a coherent mental model to what exactly is going on. Because the previous mental model was that you have a logical brain and you have an artistic brain. Is obviously stupid, is obviously not going to cut it. This is way more sophisticated than that. And in fact, that has destroyed the reputation of this body of knowledge. Ian resurrected it and began to discuss how profound this is. Now, I just want you to think about this because this is very difficult for us to comprehend, to think about how radical this idea is. What we consider Joe's personality, his character, his identity, is literally just one half of what he is. The person that we see as Joe seems to sit in one side of his brain. And when you talk to Joe, it seems like you're just talking to one half of him. There is an entire other brain, perhaps even another person inside of Joe's skull that talks via symbols and dreams, that's not as apparent and not conscious, that is a separate dude that sits on Joe's shoulder and talks to Joe. That's a real thing. That's actually what's going on here. And this is a complete breakdown in so many psychological paradigms, because what you're basically getting here is a notion that what the psychologists like Freud and Jung were calling the unconscious is actually right there and able to be studied by neuroscience. It's right there on the right half of most people's brains. Some people have it on the left half of their brain, but it's there. It's real. Now, maybe it's reductive. Maybe this is too speculative. Of course, I'm not a professional psychologist. I'm not a professional neuroscience. I'm an entertainer on the internet, so I'm capable of speculating. These guys have to be more reserved. But I think this speculation is not unwarranted. This is profound and bizarre enough as it is. Now, what's so crazy about Ian McGilchrist's work is he constantly demonstrates that the function of the right hemisphere, the hidden personality, is literally to act like a helper, to act like a guardian angel, is maybe the craziest way you could say it. And it spends all this time paying attention to the surroundings and the atmosphere and things that your processing conscious brain can't really focus on, which is exactly what we'd expect out of an unconscious process. And it serves to give us information and speak to us and guide us. And it's able to come in and short circuit our conscious mind and make us pay attention to things. And it has all sorts of profound neurochemical wiring so that it is in control, for example, of our fear response and our adrenaline responses. Because its entire goal is to sort of act like a background assistant, act like an AI of sorts that is taking care of everything, paying attention to things that we don't usually pay attention to. Now, to really comprehend how bizarre this is, when you're having a conversation with someone, you're exchanging meaning. And this is what the left hemisphere, the conscious hemisphere, does. I'm speaking to you about, whatever I'm talking about here, and I'm sending little word signals. And this goes into your Wernicke's area at the back, and you process it as meaning, and you interpret, and you're like, this is what Steph's banging on about. And then you might say something back. And so we're having a very meaning, symbolic-driven conversation, where it's like we're exchanging info in a very direct way. But it's very famous. Everybody knows about this notion of sub-communication. This notion of things are happening outside of this. Body language. Why do Italians gesticulate? Because it actually communicates something subconsciously. And people actually don't do it consciously. People try to mimic this stuff to get this unconscious stuff sorted out. But it's usually something that happens quite naturally. There's all these things happening outside of the realm of our conscious focus. While one part of us is really dedicated to paying attention to the churning of symbols and the transfer of meaning, this entire other brain is paying attention to, like, how close is this person to me in space? What does this person smell like? Is this person smiling in a weird way that doesn't seem like it's bringing across, bad intent or something like this? Is this person implying something that I should be aware of? Is this person acting strange with their hands? Are we in a safe area? Is this person behaving and moving in a way that's confident, or are they kind of showing themselves as shifty and something like this? We literally have this guardian angel, this right hemisphere, detecting all this stuff and paying attention to all this stuff while we're having a fully fledged conversational thing where we're caught up in the meaning of what's going on. And this is what's crazy. When our right hemisphere, like a police officer or a special agent or like a bodyguard, you ever see where Putin's walking around and his bodyguards are just like, invisible? And then someone goes to touch Putin and some guy will just randomly pull down a newspaper and like just touch the guy on the shoulder and be like, stop that. The bodyguards are like this invisible background force, but when something important happens, they can just shunt in and influence what's happening. This is what your right hemisphere is like. So you're there busy talking about the meaning thing. And if the right hemisphere, the unconscious, the guardian angel detects that maybe this person's being shifty, their body language is like they're rubbing their hands together or something. And the right hemisphere notices this. You're caught up in the meaning of what's going on. The right hemisphere notices like this dude's acting very shifty here. What's going on here? The right hemisphere will inject loads of adrenaline inside of you, and that will draw your attention to what's going on. It will bring your focus, and all of a sudden you'll be in a panic mode because it's trying to protect you. That's its power. It's able to actually short circuit your mind and transfer focus in different directions. That's how it works. And this is the bizarre thing about this, is that you can converse with this right hemisphere. You can't use common language, but you can use symbolic language. People have done experiments with this where they've even discovered that the right hemisphere has a sense of humor. It makes jokes. It's listening and it's communicating with the outside world. And researchers who have these people cut in half can actually talk with the right hemisphere, completely leaving the left hemisphere, which is you, the conscious person, oblivious. You can actually have a conversation with the other half. It's like you can go and talk to Putin's bodyguards or the guardian angel, and you can converse with them, and you can talk about the left hemisphere. You can talk about the conscious person. You can talk about Putin, and Putin won't be aware of it, and you can make jokes about him. You can refer to him as the other part of your brain, and it seems like the right hemisphere is aware of this situation and is capable of doing this. This is crazy. There's so much more to this that I'd love to unpack over the coming years and do expansions on Ian McGilchrist's idea, because he's a genius. Like, what he figured out is just mind-blowing, considering how accurate it is. And this has to give credit then to what Jung did, because Jung was actually hitting upon this, but feeling it around in the dark for it. He was trying to understand what was happening and clutching onto forms that sort of make sense with this. Now, again, remember what I was saying about Freud. Freud's is very blunt and mechanical and reductive. Jung was suggesting that the unconscious has an active personality. Now, we're seeing right here in the structures of our brains that that's correct. There is a separate entity inside of your head. You're made of two things, two forces. Now, what you are is the holistic experience of that, but you have an ego and you have an intelligent, separate consciousness that's acting as your guardian angel. And Jung even had a word for this. He called it the anima. And this is the Latin word for the soul. And, this is actually what we're starting to see here. There's this separate force doing all these outside tasks that can symbolically communicate with the outside world, outside of your awareness, and also symbolically communicate with you, by the way. There's some very interesting things on that front. And this is a real thing. It's here in the literature. It's showing up in the studies. Now, again, it's very speculative from me. But I think this is going to start to become a revelation over the next couple of years, because this is real. It's here. It's correct. And it's not the way that people currently think. You see, again, because the original version of logical left brain, artistic right brain showed up, a lot of modern neuroscience hates this idea. And they push away, and they call even Ian McGilchrist the quack and stuff, because it's going back to that old model that was debunked. Aren't you aware that, we've long debunked this silly notion? This is not a correct way of seeing things. And that's the sort of smart perspective, And so people are very caught up in the idea of neural networks and the way that network interactions happen across the brain. And that's a very real thing. Like, this is absolutely correct that you have network systems that operate across the brain. That's absolutely true. But this more fundamental structural difference, this is a big enchilada that most people tend to overlook. And this is what makes Jung a genius. His mental model was very early. It's very speculative, but it was correct. He was going in the right direction. He was feeling around and actually touching the object of how our brains are shaped. Freud even before him, and it's not like Freud was necessarily wrong, but Jung's crazy, mystic, animated and intelligent unconscious seems like it's been proven correct. Now again, think about the psychological context for this. We're talking here about you being able to receive information that, first of all, is outside of not only your conscious experience, but in fact your lived experience. You're going to receive information about what to do in your life that you've never learned, that has been imprinted inside of your mind. So Freud was saying that we have that superego that develops all that trauma. Here we're talking about something even more bizarre. It's like the superego gets filled up by your parents' experience. It's ancestral brain or something like this. Now, there are studies on this, but they're all done on animals. And of course, this means that this is speculation. But luckily, we don't have to put on our serious hats. We can be very, very speculative. Take, for example, this one. Genetic memory of ancestral environments help organisms readapt. Organisms carry long-term memories of their ancestral homelands that help them adapt to environmental change, according to a new study that involved raising chickens on the Tibetan Plateau and the adjacent lowland site. You see, chickens were originally domesticated in South Asia from red jungle fowl, whatever those blokes were. And this is about 5,000 years ago. And the chicken was brought into the Tibetan plateau about 1,000 years ago. And they required adaptations, such as an increase in their capacity for red blood cells. So they had to develop, new powers, if you so will. Now, what they basically find is that they take a species of chicken out of their ancestral homeland, or maybe one of these species that have been living outside of their ancestral homeland, perhaps for thousands of years, and they bring them back and hatch them back in their old ancestral homeland. So this is where they evolved to be. All of a sudden, what these guys discovered is that RNA switches on. And what RNA is an interpreter of DNA. It helps you actually use your DNA. It's like a translator maybe, or something like this. Or a guy who takes a book and transcribes it into a script so it can be turned into a film. So you need this guy in the middle, or else the film is not going to be made. And this is what RNA does. And so when RNA experiences, when your body feels that it's in some place that's ancestral, it's able to actually dig into old memories, old information that has been stored from this ancestral home, and switch all this stuff on, and switch on the things that adapt it. But this stuff goes latent, it hides away, it becomes, hidden DNA or turned off DNA, or the RNA doesn't utilize this DNA when it's in unfamiliar areas. It kind of lets you be free to take risks and experiment, and it becomes a bit more conservative in new lands. Now, of course, this is not some proof that Carl Jung's collective unconscious is completely real, but it's the beginning of an idea that the impressions of our lived experience carry on forward through the generations. Interestingly, the folks at the WEF are into this, the Economic Forum, and they describe that we previously showed that worms inherit small RNA following the starvation and viral infections of their parents. These small RNAs helped prepare their offsprings for similar hardships, Dr. Ravacci said. He goes on to explain the research, noting we also identified a mechanism that amplified heritable small RNAs across generations, so the response was not diluted. We found that the enzymes called RD or PSs are required for recreating new small RNAs to keep the response going in subsequent generations. So what we see here is the impression and experiences of the past getting coded epigenetically into the descendants, so that when they carry forward, they have the experience inside of them, or at the very least the adaptive response inside of them. They have something inside of them, perhaps you could say, that switches on in a worst case scenario. So this is again creating this idea that there is a connection to who we are, from where we come from and the people we come from. And here's an example for some mice studies, which are always a lot of fun. Behavior can be affected by events in previous generations which have been passed on through a form of genetic memory, animal studies suggest. Experiments showed that a traumatic event could affect the DNA in sperm and alter the brains and behaviors of subsequent generations. A Nature Neuroscience study shows mice trained to avoid a smell passed their aversion on to their grandchildren. Experts said that results were important for phobia and anxiety research. The animals were trained to fear a smell similar to cherry blossom. The team at Emory University of Medicine in the US then looked at what happened inside the sperm. They showed a section of DNA responsible for sensitivity to the cherry blossom scent was made more active in the mice's sperm. Now, how they can analyze that, that's pretty cool in and of itself. Imagine somebody looking at your sperm and seeing which DNA is active and sort of saying, all right, your kids are going to be afraid of this. You're afraid of, you don't like the smell of wet socks? Well, I'm afraid your sperm says your kids aren't going to like it either. It's like, all right. And they showed a section, both the mice's offspring and the mice's offspring as well, the baby's mice's offspring, were extremely sensitive to cherry blossom and would avoid the scent, despite never having experienced it in their lives. Changes in brain structure were also found. The experiences of a parent, even before conceiving, markedly influence both structure and function in the nervous system of subsequent generations. Now, there's an even more sophisticated mouse experiment that I'm aware of, where they train mice on how to make it through a maze. Now, that's obviously quite a complicated task and a very specific task. It's not just like a smell, but it's actually finding your way through an actual operation of some sort. And you'd have to learn that and store it as, quite coherent map-based memory of sorts. And they train a generation of mice on this maze. And then what they do is they take the children of those mice and put them into this maze without ever having shown them this maze before. And the children of those mice are able to make their way through the maze. They know the way around the maze. It's as if their parents have coded this information and passed it down to them. And there's a litany of common descriptions of people experiencing this, like a pharmaceutical factory or something starts to poison sugar to kill off roaches or rodents or bugs of some sort. And this works for, a couple of months or 7 or 8 generations, 9 generations. And then all of a sudden the roaches stop eating sugar. They had developed an aversion to sugar. Now, of course, you could say, is this maybe they're watching their friends die or something, and this becomes they organize a committee, the roach committee, in a meeting. They sit each other down, they're like, stop eating sugar. But we would have to take the approach, if we're going to be good Darwinians, that these roaches, because this is how Darwin sort of works, these roaches are hard coded with a set of traits, and these genetic traits are like permanent, and when they're born they get shunted out into the world in some sense, and if they all die, well, that's the failure of those genetic traits, and natural selection takes its course, and there's no capacity for adaptation. That's called Lamarckianism, which people don't like. Apparently that's very silly, and this is clearly not what people see. They see this capacity to adapt. They see this capacity to remember these experiences and change. And it would be very weird for a cockroach to develop a mutation that is against sugar. That just seems like such a strange thing to happen. For natural selection to work in this way, it seems like there has to be some type of creative influence. Now, of course, this starts to get a little bit speculative when you move it into the realms of humanity, because we're dealing with the mind, and we have some issues with this. What happens when we have a young kid who describes a past life or a memory that doesn't seem to make sense? For example, maybe their grandfather's house that they've never been to because maybe the parents traveled away, and they describe this part of the house because this has happened before. And then they get brought back to the grandfather's house and they recognize the place and they say, oh, this is where I was. And it's like, well, how did you know this? You've never been here before. But they're getting impressions inside of their imagination of this. What is happening there? Is this an unlocking of visual memory? Is this the imprinting of something like this inside of their DNA that manifests as unlocked genetic code, which presents itself as a mental experience, which is a scene inside of their imagination? How far does that stuff go? Like, that's starting to get into crazy town at that point. And of course, the thing with Jung that was so powerful is that he was asserting this notion. Instead of the very reductive idea that we have, maybe our personal memories and our urges, Jung was suggesting we have not only that, but also a guardian angel of sorts, a muse, an anima, intelligent soul, like perhaps the right hemisphere. And then he was also discussing that we don't only wrestle with our own unconscious, but we wrestle with the unconscious of all the people that came before us. And this is not too crazy. Our genes make our brain. Our brain clearly manifests many of the mental phenomenon that we love and adore so much. So why wouldn't we assume that this genetic reshaping can have some type of influence on our minds, our imagination, the architecture of who we are? And isn't the great challenge of psychology, or you could say psychoanalysis, is to understand that there are all these forces. You have the instincts. You have your own personal trauma. You have this guardian angel on your shoulder, which perhaps is the right hemisphere. You have perhaps even all these memories that are impressed inside of you in your DNA. These are all forces that are very much outside this little conscious ego of yours, and they're pulling you apart and pulling you in all different directions. And isn't the purpose of you putting yourself together psychologically about trying to get all of these things on side, trying to understand all these forces and learning to work with them, learning to recognize them? How do I interpret my instinctive urges? How do I make sense of my sexual desires? How do I make sense of my anger, my hunger? How do I discipline myself and control these? How do I process my trauma? And that's all actually quite intelligent and wise, and of course Freud would make sense with this too. And then we get on to the more advanced stuff, which is like, well, what about the schizophrenic guardian angel that sits on the other side of my brain? How do you deal with this? Because if it's a real phenomenon, we should develop a relationship with this. And the same goes with the yoga bunnies. They're often talking about the fact that you have to deal with your ancestral trauma. Maybe there's a little bit to that. Many of your vices and your virtues are not necessarily your own, but you're still responsible to deal with them. You may have inherited them, been given gifts, and also some sour grapes, and it's up to you to try and make sense of them and carry the legacy forward. Well, that's lovely, Steph. Carl Jung was right all along. Didn't expect that. When I tuned into Uber Boyo, I didn't expect him to say, guess what? Carl Jung actually knew a couple of things. Well, there you go. There's proof. There's the full assertions that Jung is getting vindicated. That Steph is always right. He's always ahead of the curve. Now, how could this be practical? Because it's nice maybe knowing these things, but what can you actually do with this that will influence your life in some way? I've had people ask me before, how exactly would you go about doing Jungian psychology? Like, how exactly would it work? What would be the correct way to do it? Now, of course, it's quite a comprehensive body of knowledge. And I think, oh God, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but it can become a bit of an issue if you get too involved with Jungians, because they get bewitched by the jargon, as I like to say. You know, there's this body of knowledge that Jung writes that's highly technical, and he uses jargon in order to communicate very difficult concepts. And because of this, people get bewitched by the abstraction, and they don't understand the abstraction is supposed to be attached to some lived experience that's going to help people's lives. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what is these abstractions mean on first principle? And I've gotten in loads of trouble with the Jungians before by suggesting that some of the felt phenomenon that Jung may have been experiencing would probably have been some of the things I'm describing here. And I think they get even more power when we connect them to our modern neuroscientific paradigm. I think that actually gives us an awful lot of credibility when we're trying to think about this stuff. We can be much more sure that the things that we're talking about are real. So, for example, Jung would speak about the anima. Now, I don't want to be reductive and say something like your soul is a piece of jelly inside of your head, but the way Jung described the anima as this outside force that has a personality, that sits on your shoulder, that is guiding you throughout your life, that has this type of quality of speaking to you. This is very much like the right hemisphere. In fact, Jung's concept of individuation is surprisingly like what you might think of as the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere learning to work together, to team up. Because he says that you begin as this ego, unaware, which is almost like what the left hemisphere is in the realm of order, as they say. And then what will happen is you'll start to experience the shadow. And Jung is very clear about this, is that the shadow actually sort of comes to you in a weird way, because it's the opposite of the little framework you've put together. You've put together your little left hemisphere concept of the world, and it's stupid and dumb, and it doesn't work because you're stupid and dumb and your left hemisphere is a schizophrenic. So you're basically living as a schizophrenic, but you're in bliss and you're in heaven and you think everything is right. And of course there's inconsistencies, and so this is where the shadow appears. And so you'll have all these like strong emotions towards things. You might be like, Uber Boyo makes me so mad. You're mashing your fist on the table. He says things that I don't want him to say. I want him to not say those words because I should have the authority over what comes out of people's mouths. And so you get really angry at stuff like this. I'm like, all right, that anger is pretty interesting though. You just freak out in your house and flip your tables over this, over nothing. You'll have these biases, you'll have these urges inside of yourself. And so this will be the shadow arriving, and some basic Jungian notions about how to engage with the shadow is simple things like think about things you hate. Think about people you envy. Think about people you resent. Think about things you dislike about yourself. Think about the negative thoughts that you have. Think about the negative experiences you've had. Think about things you're afraid of. Think about evil. Is there a friend you hate? Ask yourself, is there anything you admire in him? Is that why you hate him? Do you hate women because they don't give you appreciation? Is there any way you could see woman as in a different way that could be maybe more empowering to you? Maybe you can see that her ruthlessness is something that you could try to embrace and try to overcome. And it could actually be a calling for you to become more powerful so that you can dominate her. I'm doing this for Jung, babe. And it's like, all right, yeah. You know, we're not going to go into that side of things. But you know what I'm saying. Maybe if you're worried about violence. Violence is scary. Would you ever go into a realm of violence? Go into a boxing ring. Experience violence. Have the touch of violence upon your body. Feel someone clock you in the jaw. Feel what it is to have the strike of violence grace your nervous system. Enact violence upon someone. Be cruel. Don't be cruel in the boxing ring or you get knocked unconscious. But, go in and fight and be sadistic. Hurt someone. Try to hurt somebody. Within reason. Win sparring when you both agree. For good Lord's sake. But go in and try to have that experience of being an attacker, being somebody who's dangerous. Capture danger for yourself. Grow a pair of teeth. Become powerful. Consider all shadows, all things you do not know. Think about all the knowledge you do not know in the world. I know many things, but I don't know much about maths. Maybe there's something in maths that would be valuable. I don't know much about economics. Maybe there'd be something in economics that would be valuable. This is actually very true intellectually, maybe I could sit down and say, okay, what's the cause of all the world's problems? And you could say it's the vitality inside the Western man's soul that's gone there. And then I go and I study economics and I come across the concept of debt-based finance and usury. And all of a sudden I realize it's like, wait a second, usury is strangling the nations and they're all in these massive spiraling financial debt that raises the taxes, makes the housing expensive, makes everybody live basically as tax slaves, which drives down their fertility, makes them have to work more. What happened in 1971, guys? And then all of a sudden you start to realize how everything's connected. And this whole other body of knowledge that you dismissed as boring actually deepens and enriches your world perspective and your capacity to understand your reality. A shadow work is filled with power. And of course, what is this? This is what Jung said about the shadow. The shadow is something that is actually full of energy, but it appears to you as something that you want to avoid. You don't want to look at it first of all. And if you do, you hate it, or you have a negative feeling, hate, fear, envy, whatever. And then if you do engage with it, it's intimidating, it's scary, it's awkward. But then when you go into it and you open up the light, you actually find animating power inside of it. And this is sort of what Jung will get at. It's like inside the shadow is the anima. Once you confront the shadow, the anima almost immediately shows up. And the anima is the guide, the soul, the Hilfer. Jung had this, his soul, I've met him in the Red Book. He was like, my soul, thanks for coming. Dante had that chick, Beatrice. She walked him around hell. So what did Dante do? He went into hell, the shadow realm. Beatrice was like, I'm going to help you through here. This is an animating experience. He had his anima holding his hand, guardian angel, the muse. So how does this relate to the right hemisphere? Well, this is exactly what the right hemisphere is. The right hemisphere doesn't really exist in controlled, frigid reality. In your little framework of your routines, your left hemisphere routines, where you're going around, I'm beating stuff up, I'm talking about violence. You're going around in your life and you're dilly-dallying. You're in the realm of order, as Jordan Peterson would say. But there's all these like little pockets, little, rips, little glitches in the matrix of things that are disordered, that you don't understand, the portals into chaos, these dangerous realities, these dangerous tunnels, they're all around you at once. And these shadows, if you step into them, of course, your right hemisphere is going to have to switch on and engage with the shadow realm. And all of a sudden, this unconscious super force switches on. And what happens? You're initially scared of the shadow experience. You step into the boxing ring. You go talk to the scary girl. You go and invest $100 million into a meme coin. You go and you study usury. You go and you check that you get a girl pregnant. And you have a kid. You decide to have some convictions and like build a future. You take a risk and build a highly profound operating business and take on an enormous amount of responsibility. These are all really big experiences and they're very scary. And from the realm of order, it's like it's nice to be in your routines. But then you step into these things that you're not sure about. And you say to yourself, when you see the big shadow in front of you of this danger, you say to yourself, I'm not sure if I can do that. I'm not sure if I'm able to do that. But of course, when you step into it, an entire other brain, as powerful, actually slightly bigger than yours, apparently, the right hemisphere is slightly bigger than the left hemisphere, switches on and assists you in the realm of chaos. That's the anima coming on. You go into the shadow, the super force turns on, the guardian angel turns on and helps you. And then you begin to synthesize with it and you start to learn about it more and you learn to work with the anima. You learn to work with yourself in the realm of chaos and you start to extend yourself and develop more capacity. Your brain hemispheres talk together and work together. And so as you go and conquer the world, you change. Your brain transforms. It's like a muscle. It's like bodybuilding. You go and you bodybuild because you're a platonic idealist. You're trying to individuate and you're training this muscle and you're training your triceps, training your chest, and you're trying to get all these muscles so you idealize your physique. Jungian individuation is a sort of similar thing. You idealize your brain. You don't understand intellectually economics. You go study that stuff and it switches on parts of your imagination that shouldn't touch each other, and they synthesize. Maybe you're big into economics, but then you go and study literature. It's like those two things shouldn't go together. But for some reason, if you can synthesize them together, it transforms your mind. You go into the realm of boxing, it's going to change your brain. It's going to make you a different person. It's going to idealize what this thing could be, what this entity you are could be, because you're going into the realm of chaos. This is the Jungian path to individuation. It's very real. It's very practical. It's very straightforward and down to earth. It's about a philosophy of lived experience. You can also do it intellectually, as I keep saying, or artistically. You know, you could go and you could say to yourself, right, well, maybe I'll read my dreams. Maybe I'll go and I'll just draw a load of pictures. Maybe I'll write poetry. I'll do something somewhat irrational and get into that imaginative realm and see what happens. Maybe, for example, instead of you practicing piano or something like that, you just throw away all forms and you say to yourself, I'm going to try write some songs on piano. And you're going to try and make stuff, and you call in that ordering principle from your imagination and see what it can develop. And all of a sudden, again, the muse shows up. The guardian angel shows up and starts to make stuff for you. It's a very Jungian idea, the imagination, the unconscious switches on and begins to show you archetypes and form things almost for you. That experience is quite common with people, and it makes sense within the context of all of this. And I guess on this path, a big problem that a lot of people have, especially in the modern world, is understanding who we are for our identity, because this is a big issue with people. Are we just deracinated individuals floating around reality? Do we have nothing going for ourselves? And of course, this is where this collective unconscious idea comes from, because we have a history. We have come from somewhere. I was looking up genetics recently, and the modern scientists now are able to tell 25,000 years ago where the European people came from. There's this young boy, they found his body in Siberia crushed under a stone, and he had the Or haplogroup, which is a sort of genetic imprint of the European people. And so he was from a mammoth hunting tribe in Siberia 25,000 years ago, and his lineage, or his tribe and their descendants, went on to become probably the most successful people in all of human history. They created Rome and Persia and the West. And it's insane to just think about his experience lives inside of me, Like he was wandering through Siberia at the fall of the Ice Age, stalking mammoth up there in Hyperborea with all the boys. And his challenges and struggles, his pains, his confusions, the learnings that he had to do, the things that he had to figure out in order to survive, they all exist inside of me. It's all stored in my DNA, and it's been passed down to me. I carry that legacy with me. And every ancestor since, and that's a lot of generations, That's a lot of generations, man. And that's how close we are to this. And they've all been through a life that I've been, and built up experiences and knowledge and imprinted it inside of myself. And so when I go out into the world and I confront myself and I have to start to rely on my instincts and stuff like this, I start to realize, oh my God, I've done this before. Every single ancestor that's come before me has achieved almost all of these things. It's very unlikely they wouldn't have, or else they wouldn't have made it. They wouldn't have procreated. And that's an amazing thing to consider. It's a really, really powerful thing to consider. And so this turns into this same Jungian thing. It's like, who were your ancestors? Get in contact with them. Maybe even look at your family tree. It's always a nice thing to do, and start to flesh out the story. And I noticed this with my parents, for example. This is, again, it's what's beautiful about Jung is how you start to see his stuff in real life in a very intuitive way. And when my parents started to get a bit older, they started to search up the family tree because they wanted to know. They wanted to know who all the people were in their ancestry. So they started going around to the local graves in Ireland. And they started to speak to people, and they found people like, yonder fourth cousins once removed, and then they started to trace the family lineages and see how far back they can go. And even back only into the 19th century, they created this enormous picture of Irish people over in New York. They have people coming in from France, Huguenots coming in from France. They've gone back and found Normans. They found Gaels going all the way back to the Brian Boru and stuff like this. Just they're just finding all these trains, and they study into them and learn about them. And you start to realize it's like within me, like I am this nexus that has had so many enormous forces synthesizing to become me. The Normans, man. The Normans live in me. The Normans were the Vikings. The Normans came out of the land of ice and snow and conquered basically the entire world out of England and France. What an incredible people. The Huguenots are just such a crazy people as well. And it's just weird because then, you know, one of my Gaelic side of my family, or like one of the Gaelic ancestries apparently killed some Huguenots. So I don't know, we're fighting against each other. The Ulster Scots, same thing. The Gaels, like all the Gaels in my family, there's loads of them. They all go back, you know, they go back so far to the ancient Celts. And these were the people who Rome fought against when Julius Caesar conquered Gaul. That was the Celts, and it was these people, and they had this big empire before. It's crazy to think that like all these forces are synthesizing and sloshing, and then some of them went over to America. It's incredible. It's mind-blowing to think of what you are, like what your people have been through, what the spirits inside of you have been through. And it makes you understand why the religions of the past would often have like ancestor worship as the first principle, because it just makes so much clear sense that, you know, Mufasa is inside of you type thing. And it really is true. So I guess the Jungian project is to try fill yourself out, a perpetual long-term project of, you know, adding more details to who you are. Testing yourself, going out into the world, taking challenges, skills, actions, going out into your intellect and your imagination and expanding your creativity, expanding your realms of knowledge, going into your past, into your people, coming to understand who you are, where you come from, even start with like, what were your parents' lives actually like? Get them to actually paint the picture. Because there's probably an awful lot more into them than you actually think, my friend. And try it with your granny then, you know, like your parents are going to be some job. Start there. You know, try to understand what it was like for them. Maybe they lived in the 80s or the 90s or the 70s, whatever it was. Figure that out. See, so like, try to just put your perspective and think about your dad and think about what he was like, you know, and what was like, you know, you live in your 20s or whatever, and you're thinking, or your 30s or your teen, whatever you are, whatever you people are out there nowadays, whatever slang is common, what was his reality like when he was that age and he had that stupid brain that you had? And then go back to your grandfather, you know, and try flesh that out and come to comprehend who you are. These are enormous powers, incredible things to do. So there's a rant on ways that you can synthesize Jungian powers, expand the capacity of your consciousness. Now it seems like the camera is getting drunk. All this talk of the collective unconscious from an Irishman seems like it's making my camera drunk and go blurry. It's like Saturday night, the camera's just coming in and out of consciousness, being like, whoa, dude, the Guinness and the whiskey is hitting me. All right, lads, I think we'll wrap it up there. But there's some practical tips. I hope you enjoyed. Stay juicy and bye-bye.